Hi, thank you for joining me in my study. We've been thinking about the doctrine of the imputation of sins, that our sins were imputed legally to Christ, on the basis of which God condemned and punished Christ for our sins. And we saw that through the device of legal fictions, God could adopt the legal fiction that Christ actually did those sins and therefore was worthy of judgment. But suppose we think of imputation not as the imputation of our very acts to Christ, but rather the imputation to Christ of the guilt of our sins, so that Christ is not imputed the wrongdoing that we did, but rather the guilt of our wrongdoing is imputed to Christ. Is that without experience in our legal system? Well, as it turns out, it is not at all without parallel in our legal system. One of the most fascinating areas of the law that I've begun to explore is called vicarious liability. And in cases of vicarious liability, the guilt or liability of a wrongdoer is imputed to someone else, so that that other person is held liable or guilty for the wrongs committed by another person. And this is typically based upon the legal principle called respondeat superior, which basically means let the master answer. And the idea here is that a master can be held liable for the acts that his servant does in the course of his service for the master. On the contemporary scene, this principle has been extended by courts to cover the employer-employee relationship, so that in cases in which the employee does some wrongful act in the service of his employer, that act or the liability for it can be imputed to the employer. In civil law, where one gives liability for damages or awards liability for damages, these typically involve cases in which the sale of retail products illegally is done by an employee, and the liability for that is ascribed or imputed to the employer. For example, if the employee illegally sells tainted meat or mislabeled food or alcohol to a minor, the liability for that wrongdoing is imputed to his employer, even though the employer did nothing wrong. And it needs to be emphasized that in these cases of vicarious liability, the employer is not being blamed for negligence or complicity in any way. He may be wholly faultless, and yet he is held vicariously liable for the wrongdoing of his employee. Now you might say, well, but that's in civil law. That just concerns penalties, fines, and damages. But in fact, the principle of vicarious liability also applies to criminal law. There are crimes which can be committed by an employee, which are then imputed to his employer, so that the employer is held to be guilty for the crimes committed by the employee, even though the employer did absolutely nothing wrong. And there are literally thousands of these sorts of statutory laws involving elements of strict liability that will involve this vicarious imputation of guilt to a person who did not actually do the crime. In fact, it's interesting that in many cases, it will be the employer who is held to be the principal in the crime and who is responsible for it, and the employee, the one who actually did the act, will be merely an accessory to the crime. So in vicarious liability, we seem to have what amounts to an exact parallel to the imputation of guilt to Christ. The relationship between the employer and the employee is similar to the relationship between Christ and us. And the wrongs that we do, the guilt and liability of our wrongdoing, can be imputed by God to Christ, even though he is perfectly innocent, and therefore Christ can be punished for those crimes that we commit, thereby discharging our liability before God. So it seems to me that in the law we do have very, very close parallels to the idea of the imputation of sins. And therefore this doctrine cannot be rejected as incoherent without at the same time rejecting the system of Anglo-American law in which vicarious liability plays an important part.